Welcome to another episode of Highway to Hill, a pro-Congress podcast about the messiest and most important branch of government. I'm Charlie Hunt, political scientist from Boise State University. I am joined by my trusty colleague, political scientist Sorrel Gaynor from the University of Virginia. Hey, Sorrel.
Hey, Charlie.
Today on Highway to Hill, we are very excited to welcome an excellent guest to help us get a little realistic, to help us learn a bit about how to contact Congress, when it works, when it doesn't, how we can make it better. We're joined by Anne Meeker, the managing director of PopVox Foundation and a former House casework director. Anne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you guys so much for having me. And also 10 out of 10 podcast name, phenomenal. We love it.
Thank you. We were pretty proud of that one, I think, when it came about. Well, thanks for helping us make it even better by teaching us a thing or two. I want to get into all this great stuff about calling Congress, what that means, what that looks like, whether it's helpful. I wonder if first you could tell us a little bit about PopVox Foundation, whether folks have heard about it or not. What is it y'all are trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say you probably haven't heard of us because we are teeny, teeny, tiny. But I'm so glad you framed this as a pro-Congress podcast because that is our happy place as PopVox Foundation. We always joke that we are a team of mostly former congressional staffers who just can't quit the institution. That we were so motivated by our experience of serving in both chambers for both parties, in district offices and DC offices, that our work is really dedicated to helping Congress strengthen Congress and help Congress continue to play its constitutional role into the next century and beyond. So we do a lot of work with researching and advocating for kind of pro-Congress changes to the institution itself. We are an aggressively nonpartisan team. I always like to joke that we are pro-Congress and pro-Congress's ability to carry out its constitutional responsibilities.
You are in good company with us.
Yes.
That is exactly where we like to be, too.
So, Anne, why don't we start with, you sort of hear this refrain whenever a big issue comes up. I mean, there's always some big issue on the agenda, but, if we're trying to sort of motivate voters or non-voters for that matter to sort of get involved or have their voice heard, it's call your member of Congress, right? That the member of Congress is supposed to be like your eyes and ears in Washington, your person on the ground who can like help your district get your voice heard. But like most people probably don't call Congress, right? So what does that actually look like in your experience? Like what's the process on the congressional side?
So for background again on my role in my former life as a congressional staffer. So as we mentioned, I worked in a district office. District offices are really interesting because they are kind of the front door to Congress in your community, in your backyard. Every American is served by their member in the House, and then you have that district office that should be within driving distance to you, where you can go and talk to your member of Congress's staff in person. So I know we always kind of shorthand the idea of contacting Congress as calling Congress, and I completely do this too. But there's actually a huge spectrum of ways that you can talk to Congress. But on the congressional side, all of those filter into a CRM. So if you've worked in any kind of sales position or any kind of business customer service role, you've probably used something like HubSpot or Salesforce or Zendesk. So you might have a sense for a little bit what this looks like in a congressional office. But you can take that idea of that Zendesk or that Salesforce, that HubSpot, whatever, and kind of move it, for the most part, move it back 10 years in time. And that's what a congressional office is working on. So when a constituent calls, when a constituent emails, when they walk in the front door, when they send a letter, all of those pieces of contact end up in that CRM. They're all entered into that CRM by whoever picks up the phone, whoever's responsible for handling the mail. So the first thing that office is doing is verifying whether the writer, the caller, whoever is actually a constituent. And then they're actually summarizing that person's ideas. So then where that all ends up is in a process called batching. So staff for that member of Congress kind of takes that full spectrum of input, whether it's phone, emails, whatever, and sorts it out into batches. And the batches kind of group those opinions, those expressions, those testimonies. So that might be something like a, pro ACA batch or an anti-ACA batch. And then from there, two things happen. First of all, that staffer turns that into kind of data for that member to look at, that member and the senior staff to look at. So that member might get a readout at the end of the week that says, we got XYZ number of calls that were pro this bill. We got X number of calls that were against this bill. And then also the other thing is that those constituents get a response. Every office approaches this a little bit differently for how they decide to send out those responses, when they decide to send out those responses. But I think most offices really do care about trying to make sure that constituents feel heard, and a big part of that is making sure they get a letter, they get an email back.
So obviously calls, visiting, letters, these are like kind of traditional, even email can fall under this, as like more traditional ways to contact Congress. And, the behind the scenes, there seems like a pretty formulaic approach to responding to those. But obviously, like a big part of contacting Congress today is social media campaigns and these sort of like viral campaigns, or tweeting at your member or writing on Facebook. So how do members of Congress, how do congressional offices tackle those? How do they view those? And I guess putting on your policymaking hat in a way, like what are ways that you think Congress could improve in responding to like probably one of the more popular ways of contacting Congress today?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I will say this is probably the area of kind of communicating with Congress at scale where there's the most variation between offices and how they handle those. So social media is really tough for members, just in that there are multiple channels to be monitoring. Again, you have all of your different social media platforms. And then also, depending on those platforms, it can be really tough to kind of discern the signal and the noise. This is tough across any way that Congress is hearing from constituents right now. There's a lot of noise and really tough to kind of distill down and figure out that signal, and different ways to figure out, is what I'm hearing actually representative of majority opinion in my district? And social media is even harder. Some platforms will show a member of Congress like, hey, this person is a constituent, and others don't. Others, it's just a free-for-all. So when members are thinking about constituent contact, they really want to know exactly that. How am I hearing from my constituents? Because those are the opinions that matter, right? Some members really try to assign their comms person to kind of monitor social media, or maybe a junior comms person to monitor social media. I want to say it is actually kind of vibe-based. We send that person into the void and say, watch social media and give us your vibes on what's happening here. Some offices are investing a little bit more into some specialized tools, some kind of digital tools that do pull out a little bit more formal sentiment and more formal data. But this is just really a problem that Congress has not solved, of how to tackle that social media angle.
When we're talking about sort of constituents getting in touch with representatives, I feel like I already know the answer to this, and maybe our listeners do too, but I'm curious what your perspective on it is. Like, are people calling Congress to pat them on the back for doing a really great job? And, hey, I saw you did this thing I love, and I just wanted to say, great job, Slugger. Or are they like, basically treating them as an emotional punching bag, like when they're really angry? I have the feeling I know the answer, but can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of it?
And I think we're all laughing because we've all been on the other end of those phone calls where you are very much someone's emotional punching bag. No, there are definitely constituents that call to say, good job, keep fighting the good fight. And those calls... So let me back up for a second, too, just to be clear. Like, the person answering the phone is almost never the member of Congress. Some do it for show sometimes. It is usually an intern or a junior staffer.
Important to remember when you're calling Congress and, like, going to unload on someone. Like, a lot of my students are interns at these places, and, like, they're sometimes not getting paid. They're, they're just you say what you want to say, but I'm just going to step in front as a human shield for some of these interns.
100%. And genuinely, we're off on a tangent now, but genuinely, like the level of vitriol and violent language and threatening language and just disgusting behavior that some interns and some junior staff get on the phones here is really tough. And of course I understand. Again, we can talk about that emotional punching bag outlet function that members of Congress do serve. We're in a crazy political moment. There are really important reasons to feel fired up about policy. But yeah, the big takeaway for me is always just keep your pants on, be nice to the interns. Everyone's going to be okay. But as far as why people are actually calling, are they calling to say do something different, or they're calling to say good job? From my experience, I'd actually bucket it out into a few different reasons that people are calling. The first is just kind of the organic, like someone wants Congress to know something, whether that's a personal opinion or whether that's an experience. I remember in our district office, we actually had this delightful gentleman who called us at least once a week and always said, good afternoon, Congressman, whoever. I would like your staff to go to scientificamerican.com and search for this article title, and I want you to print it out and read that article because it's important that you take this into account in your policy making. Love that guy.
Lovely.
Love people like that.
I know. I want someone to do
Fabulous.
that for me.
It was the cutest,
Yeah.
kindest thing. My interns always so looked forward to hearing from him. We did print out those articles. It was lovely. So that's the kind of like, I want Congress to know something. And then there's the, I need something from Congress, and we can get more into this later. But Congress actually does provide a bunch of individually direct services to individuals in their district. So there's also people that are calling because they need something. They need help. They need to participate in a formal process that member runs. And then actually the biggest bucket, and I think folks who work in constituent engagement, civic engagement space don't always realize how much this is the majority of calls to Congress, but it is calls that are kind of activated by some form of advocacy. So whether that's, the NRA sends out an alert, the Sierra Club sends out an alert, Susan B. Anthony list, Planned Parenthood, whatever, are sending out something that is activating people to call. Like, that's the call to action from these advocacy organizations that say, there's a big vote coming up, there's a bill coming up, like, you need to talk to your member of Congress. Looking just data-wise at the amount of incoming to members' offices, that is the vast majority of why people reach out, or the mechanism through which people reach out. And then that last piece, like you said, that outlet, that again, we're in a crazy moment and people feel like stuff is out of their control, that they don't have agency to impact these giant things that are so morally weighty. But the thing that you can do, the thing that you can always do as a constituent, as a citizen, is call your member. And so that's the other kind of bucket for how I think about what motivates people to reach out.
To bring up social media again, and like with those buckets and these like kind of trends over time, have you seen, and I get it on my Instagram a lot or whatever, like call your member now, things like groups like 5 calls and things like that. Have you seen an upward trend in phone calls overall, particularly those in this sort of advocacy bucket in the past? I mean, I guess maybe since like smartphones have been commonplace.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And to get nerdy for a second, you guys know this is political science. It's part of the trouble of studying Congress is that there is just not good data. So one of the things people may not realize about congressional data, and that includes congressional phone calls and stuff like casework, is that data is the personal property of that member of Congress. They can choose to share it. They can choose to not share it at the end of their term. They can destroy it. They can pass it on. They can do whatever they want with it. So it is really tough to kind of get a really good data grounded sense for just what's happening with those trends. However, on the whole, absolutely, we really have seen a huge uptick in the volume of outreach to Congress. And I think one thing I'd really emphasize is just overall that call volume is probably higher. But the biggest thing is just the variation in the highs and lows, I think, is a lot greater too. That we see these kind of moments of crazy activation and crisis where a congressional office will be absolutely overwhelmed by calls. One thing that is doing is actually nudging offices away from answering live phone calls, which is really interesting to watch. So we are seeing some offices say, either in general, we're going to send constituents through an automated line where they can leave a voicemail and we'll respond later. Or in these moments of crazy crisis, we're going to turn off the phones, we're going to send people to voicemail, and we will, like, just for the amount of staff we have to manage this exercise, like, we have to bottleneck this so that we can keep up.
Right. So getting through all this data and dealing with it and parsing it the way you were talking about before, where it is intelligible in some way or provides some data point for members to use in, maybe deciding whether to vote yes or no on some particular thing or prioritize some issue, is hard. If you're on the other side of the equation making these calls, probably, I assume it's fair to wonder, right? And I get this skepticism from, people in my life who are not political scientists but who want to be politically involved. Like, come on, does this really matter? Do they really care what I think? Especially when it comes in the midst of like these calls to action. Maybe sometimes they're scripted, right? Where people are sort of giving the same sort of reaction and feedback. Maybe they're calling their own member's office. Maybe they're calling a party leader's office. How do some of those factors and variables play in terms of, to your knowledge, like how effective a call like that can actually be? Like what makes a good phone call or an email or something that's likely to get the attention of a member?
Oh my gosh, which is the $64,000 question with so many complex variables. We could spend a few hours on this for sure. Some places to start though. So the bottom line here, take one thing away, calling your member is effective and it's important. It is really, really important. on so many different levels for members to know that they have active, engaged constituents who are watching and care and are willing to participate. Like, representation is a partnership between the represented and the representative, right? Like, if half of that partnership is not holding up their end of the bargain and participating and telling the member, this is what's important to me, then this all falls apart. So yes, it's important, do it. There are ways to do it more effectively than others. And the first piece is recognizing that not every members are not interchangeable, that different members have different opportunities and different ways to be effective on behalf of their constituents. There are a lot of things that go into that. Are you in the majority party? Are you in the minority party? Are you senior on your committee? Are you junior on your committee? Which committees are you on? Full stop. The example that's always in my head was I was talking to an activist where I live in Cleveland, Ohio, who's a mom who's really fired up about gun rights and gun control. And she was asking me, how, I'm so afraid for my children. How do I, and I feel like I'm calling my members and I'm not getting there. What's going on? How can I do this better? And I had to kind of walk her through, like, it's tough, right? Your members clearly also care about this. You have a few members in your delegation who've spoken out about this. However, none of them are on judiciary. None of them are on the committee. That is going to be the committee that is responsible for evaluating gun control legislation. So there are other ways that you can be impactful, that you need to be thinking about the full spectrum of what's available to you as an activist to care about, to work on the issues that you care about. Telling this member who's not on that right committee, it might be a backbencher in the minority party, like, you have to manage your expectations for what they can do for you. But with that said, there are a bunch of things that individual members can do besides just passing legislation, and that's where you need that seniority, you need that majority control. That member can do some interesting oversight, they can do some committee work, they can do some kind of spotlighting, change the narrative media work around why certain issues are important. So it's also, the other thing I always say to people is that it's really important to think about how can you position yourself as a resource for that member. We talked about the partnership between representatives and represented, people who are represented, and also being nice to the interns on the phone. Like, all of that is connected, right? If you can build up a relationship with your member office, your district staff, your policy staff, by becoming a known quantity, saying, I care about this issue, I know about this issue, I am willing to support you on whatever you need to do. Are you going to host an event in our district that's about this issue? Like, let me know, I will be there. Do you need someone to write a letter to the editor here? Can I be a policy resource for you? If you're considering legislation, you want to just talk to someone with experience in your district, like, put me on your list, I'm down. Building up those relationships takes time. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of investment on the part of constituents. But, like, that's where you build that relationship with your member, where you are going to be heard. They know your face when they think about an issue, and that's what's important in changing their decision making.
So for people who want to do that, what would you say are like 3 things they could do today to start building that relationship?
So the first thing is get on your members' newsletter list. Every member has a newsletter. Friends at DC Inbox do like a phenomenal job of putting these together.
We love
so you can look at all
them. We
of them.
love
We're
Lindsay.
obsessed. It's so good. But that's where your member is going to be doing things like flagging local events. And that's your opportunity to go make friends with those staffers. Be the person that shows up and is a butt in a seat when they're trying to fill a room, and, like, you are already, good job, you're in. you're on the way to a really productive, warm, welcoming, friendly relationship. And then the last thing is also just becoming familiar, and the newsletter is a way to do this, following your member on social media is a good way to do this, of just understanding there is a whole spectrum of ways that you can participate. Like we said, members have town halls, they have events in person. One thing I've really been watching over the last few years is members being increasingly creative in the district level outreach that they do, with some really interesting and unique programs that are direct services to their district and their constituents. For example, again, my member in Cleveland, Ohio runs a housing expo where she brings together nonprofits, she brings together construction companies, she brings together, like, legal resources, like, everything that you need around housing in Cleveland, Ohio, like, she puts them all in a room for you. Beth Van Dyne in Texas runs a job fair for her constituents where she pulls in, like, tens of thousands of people into, like, the Houston Astrodome, connecting job seekers and employers. And so just becoming familiar with everything that they do, like, is important for you as a constituent, figuring out your full toolkit for building that relationship. How can I influence this member? How can I support this member to do the things I'd like them to do?
All right, so last question before we move to our next segment. Both Charlie and I have written a lot and talked here a lot about sort of this like congressional capacity problem that Congress has, right? Like almost 800,000 constituents in a district with a staff size that really hasn't changed. And you mentioned earlier, like when the heat is turned on, they just kind of sometimes have to turn off the phone. So I know PopVox has been working particularly in this like modernization space for constituent communication. So, what are some of the reforms or kind of ideas that you think Congress could adopt to make constituent communication more efficient for them and then more effective for us as constituents?
This is my favorite question ever, and there's so much exciting stuff happening here. So the biggest thing I want to see is I want to see 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, I think giving members additional resources to really experiment and try new things, including trying new tools and new methods and channels for constituent engagement and feedback, that's where we're going to see some really interesting stuff. And we're not going to see interesting stuff that's like national top-down, where one organization or one, support institute within Congress is going to decide how we do constituent engagement going forward. But that's like individual members saying, I'm a super rural district, this is going to work for me, or I'm a super urban district, this is what's going to work for me. I'm a district with a bunch of Native American tribes. Like, how are we going to find the right channels that work for individual constituents and individual populations? That's going to take a bunch of things. First of all, it is resources. That is additional funding. Running a really good teletown hall for a member of Congress can cost upwards of $10,000 a pop. That comes out of a fixed budget. That's a pretty serious budgeting challenge for members to decide how are they going to invest in kind of tech-enabled accessibility solutions for expanded engagement and outreach. So we need more money. We need more staff. That's a big thing too. Especially district-level staff work just takes people, especially for big rural districts. Like, it takes time in the car to go meet with constituents where they are. That's not something that we can really scale particularly well right now. We just need people. But then that last thing is also tech approvals. So one thing we work on a ton at PopVox Foundation is looking at the process for approving new technologies for individual member use. And what we're finding right now is that approval process is just slow, that it might take 6, 8, 9 months, upwards of a year for a member to go to, the correct authority and say, I'd like to use this tool, tell me if it's safe and I can use it on the House network. And it's taking them more than half of your term in Congress to decide if you can. That really cuts down the amount of time that member has to use it and experiment and figure out if it works. So we'd also like to see that process sped up.
All right. So, Anne, we were just talking about congressional capacity, and, staff have come up a lot in this conversation. And you've mentioned a couple different times that the district staff, right, these district offices are particularly important as kind of a front door for people to be talking with their member of Congress and communicating with them. And one of the things that these district offices that we know is a big part of their jobs is undertaking constituent casework. You mentioned in a former life you were in that role. Can you tell us a little bit about what is meant by casework? Like, what kinds of cases are we talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. And the TLDR here is casework is the best thing Congress does that no one knows about, for sure. So congressional casework is part of Congress's oversight authority, which is Congress's responsibility to oversee how the executive branch implements the laws that it passes. But this is conducted really at what I think sociologists would call a street level. So on behalf of individual constituents, how is the law being applied? Is it being applied correctly? Is it being applied in line with Congress's intent? What that actually means is when a constituent is having an issue with a federal agency that they cannot resolve on their own, say a retiree whose Social Security benefit suddenly got stopped, and they try everything to call Social Security, they try to go to the Social Security office, they go to a local advocate, they go to their senior center, no one can get this fixed, no one seems to know what's happening, and they get so desperate that in a Hail Mary pass, they call their member of Congress, usually not even to ask for help, but just to say, good Lord, do you know what Social Security is doing? Is there anything you can do about this legislatively? That person would get me in a former life and my team in a former life, dedicated staff within Congress whose job is to resolve those issues on behalf of constituents. So casework is First of all, just incredible. And I wish everyone in a policy position would spend at least 6 months doing casework, because it is truly where you learn how policy works, again, at that street level, on that person to person level, where you see the impact of policy. So sometimes that is chasing a bureaucratic issue, like for our retiree with their Social Security benefits. Maybe they got filed under the wrong death date. And so we have to work through the process with Social Security to actually figure out, how do I legally resurrect them, which is something I've done. It's a crazy kind of case. But sometimes it's also where you find the places in law where there might be a conflicting statute, there might be an overlapping statute, there might be an edge case that the policy drafters didn't think about when they were designing a law. So on an individual level, it's an incredible way that individual members have an impact on their constituents. We're at the end of the first quarter of the year here. But in this first quarter, we saw a bunch of members put up their kind of year-end impact statements as a thing members are doing. And one thing that many, many, many members share is their casework numbers. And we're seeing some crazy numbers just as a snapshot for how effective these caseworkers can be, with individual members reporting literally millions of dollars in delayed and retroactive benefits that they were able to shake loose and bring back to their districts and states through this process.
So is there buckets, or at least topics, as we think about casework, and us, and maybe people not knowing that this is an option they have and a resource that is always good to remind ourselves that we do pay for, right? So
100%.
You gave the example of Social Security, and, passports is another common one. So what are some examples of things that fall under casework that maybe you wouldn't normally think of casework? And then what are some things that's not a casework call, that some common misconceptions you see?
So technically, Congress's jurisdiction for casework is federal agencies. So any of the big federal agencies, the bigger the federal agency is, the more public contact it has, the more likely you're going to get casework. So the kind of standard buckets for offices are Social Security, your retirement, your disability, your Social Security cards, the IRS, everything there. That might be a refund that's delayed, or an issue with an identity theft verification. Tons within the IRS. VA was a huge one. VA is always a big one. So that's veteran benefits as well as veteran health care. OPM is another big one. So the last year, we've seen, this huge wave of federal employees leaving federal service voluntarily or involuntarily, and that means retirement paperwork. So all of that retirement processing going through OPM as well. The Postal Service is a good one that I don't think people think about a ton. I've been chasing this refund on a package that was delayed or damaged for 1,000,000 years, and I can't get through to anybody. Or even, and these were always very sweet calls that I really appreciated getting, my letter carrier broke my screen door and I can't figure out what to do about it. Congressman, can you help me? Just some very sweet stuff. And then the giant bucket that is one of the most complicated and difficult areas of casework is immigration. So for a very topical example right now, we're seeing the unfolding crisis in the Middle East. You have thousands of Americans who are stranded with airspace closed, commercial airlines not flying, who are trying to get home. So that's a big example of where caseworkers are the ones who get the call when no one else can help. And then last but not least, the last bucket I'd like to also flag is disaster casework. So besides international crisis casework, there's also, a hurricane came through, or we had a tornado, we had a flood, and we have to navigate FEMA. We have to navigate various avenues for disaster relief. That's another place where members will really step in and be useful.
And I think we are all in agreement that casework is super important and underappreciated what members' offices do. I imagine there are always ways it could be better or better executed. Do you have anything in mind of how Congress or individual member offices could take some steps to improve this casework process, whether that's individual offices sort of changing their own policies or processes on how to do this, or if there's a legislative route to, appropriate more money for this, or staff training or something like that. Is there anything that jumps out at you that would be really important to make this important process even better?
Oh my goodness. And then again, how much time do you have? We can talk about this for a long time. No, so there are a couple big things that we are actually tracking and where the House and Senate are making really good progress, and we're really excited to see some stuff here. The biggest one is, so up top we talked about how casework is both individual service and then also how Congress learns. And we mentioned earlier as well, too, how individual offices own their own data. So that data is siloed between individual member offices. So as a caseworker, that means you're limited on figuring out how what you're seeing in casework translates to what's happening nationally. So the House is actually working on a tool, on a data aggregator tool that would be an opt-in system, so members can decide whether to put their top-line anonymized casework information into this system, but that would feed into a national dashboard saying this is what members of Congress across the whole country are seeing in terms of casework. So as an individual caseworker, there's a huge value to that just in thinking through day-to-day caseload. One of the things that drove me the most crazy as a caseworker was when I would get a pattern of cases, let's say 5 cases from our local VA system, all dealing with the same thing. And I would say to myself, it seems like there's an issue here. And I would call the VA and say, I've got 5 cases, like, tell me what's going on. And they'd say, well, it's a statistical coincidence. It's a small sample size. Go away, caseworker. So this would be tools for those caseworkers to say, no. This is not just me. This is a national issue, or this is a regional issue. So now let's get our whole delegation involved, or let's do some oversight here and try to figure out what's at the bottom of this. The other thing also is just, I keep coming back to this, but again, more tech tools and more tech openness for Congress. I just went to a health appointment at the Cleveland Clinic the other day, and my doctor, as I walked in, said, hey, I'm going to use this transcription tool so that I'm not scribbling notes or I'm not typing notes. I'm looking at you and we're having a real conversation. And I was just really taken back to days as a caseworker doing intakes where I would sit with a constituent and have to be typing and taking notes on what's going on. And again, you miss that opportunity for that really important in-person trust building relationship in that initial conversation. So I think there are a lot of tools, there are a lot of approaches to similar work from other fields that could really easily be translated to casework. And I would just love to see more resources, more opportunity for those to come on in.
Former member of Congress Kathy McMorris Rogers has a great quote that you probably know, but is Congress is a 19th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. So
for
definitely
real
captures that.
And the worst part of that is that quote is 10 years old now and it hasn't changed.
Okay, let's go to the gavel drop, our last segment. Before we go, a few different stories that caught our eye this week, and Anne has been gracious enough to bring her own gavel drop to the table. That is next level podcast guesting. So take it away, Anne. What's on your mind this week?
Hey, I don't know about gracious. You're just giving me an opportunity to talk about the thing that I'm yelling about to my friends and family. So headline, and this is something I've been tracking for the last year, and this was kind of the most recent episode in a longer story. But we recently got word that a federal judge nixed the latest policy requiring 7 days notice for members of Congress to visit ICE facilities. So this is a long story, but basically it's been legal fighting over whether members of Congress have the right to do an unannounced oversight drop-by for federal facilities. In this case, because of where we are right now, it's ICE facilities. But clearly as a former casework nerd, this is really important to members being able to do oversight for all federal agencies under all circumstances. This has been a long legal back and forth. Basically, there was language inserted into the last year's appropriations bill saying that DHS could not use federal funding to restrict members from going to these facilities, and that was challenged in court. This is kind of the ongoing battle, but I think why it's really important is that we talk a lot, there's a lot in the news right now about whether Congress is going to stand up and reclaim its constitutional authority and reclaim some of its power from the executive branch. This is actually one really tiny way where it is fighting. Individual members are fighting. The institution itself is fighting to say, no, this is our authority. This is Article 1. This is what we're supposed to be doing here, and the executive branch can't curtail our right to do so. So definitely something I'm watching.
And a form of casework, like you said
And
earlier. Thinking of it in that lens is really empowering in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, as a caseworker, this is something that we did frequently that actually got us really important results. So when I was a caseworker, we had a tough relationship with our local VA team. They had a lot of staff turnover. It was just, we were having trouble with our relationship. So we had this big sit down and we said, all right, cards on the table. We're going to fix this relationship. How are we going to work together? And one thing the VA said was, well, you're saying your veterans don't have enough support. Well, we're actually going to run these clinics in your district where we're going to send out attorneys who are going to be present and supportive. And we said, that's wonderful. How can we help? And so on the day of the first clinic, we went to Dunk's and we got 24 donuts and we toddled up the coast to the VA healthcare clinic where this was supposed to happen. And no one was there. The VA just given us a schedule for clinics that didn't exist. or that they had no intention of actually doing. It was just kind of what we felt like they were just telling us some fake clinics so that we'd shut up and go away. But then when we actually showed up and we called and said, where are you? That got the VA to actually do those clinics going forward. So sometimes the unannounced in-person visit is really the only way to figure out what's actually happening. And members of Congress absolutely should have the right to do so.
It's so important. I feel like in a couple of different ways. One, because I mean, usually the instances of this that get the most attention are like there's a media report or something else that like something horrible is happening in whether it's these ICE detention facilities or something else. And so members of Congress are like, I got to get in there and get the truth and see what's going on. Obviously, that's a really important form of oversight. But even these like softer touches where, you're dropping by and you're forming the relationship, you can catch smaller things that are wrong. And, you would think if you're the VA or if you're Department of Homeland Security or whatever else, that you would want input and feedback from the community about whether you're doing a good job and whether, whatever service you're providing is serving these needs. And like we talked about before, like that's what Congress is for, to be this conduit with the community and our eyes and ears. And so I feel like it's super important for both those reasons. So I'm so glad you shared that positive development here. So with that, I'm actually going to go next, if that's okay, Sorrel, so that we can, because mine is complaining, so we can have like a good news sandwich here. So mine is about elections. We're recording this the week before we're going to release it, and just the other day, Republican Senator from Montana, Steve Daines, rather unexpectedly announced that he was not going to seek re-election, and he did so in a very interesting way. He announced this right before, like hours before, the filing deadline for candidacy in the state of Montana. And in doing this, Daines is essentially sewing up the nomination, for the Republican nomination for senator, for Kurt Alm, I think is how you pronounce his name. He's the U.S. attorney for the District of Montana. And Alm was immediately endorsed by Daines, by Donald Trump, and by a number of other figures right as the deadline to file candidacy ended. And so, what you have here was a lot of Republicans in Montana, probably, some who might make great senators, and they were looking at this field and thinking, well, it looks like Daines is running again, so I'm not going to throw my hat in the ring. But then he does this at the very last minute to essentially guarantee that there's virtually no opposition in the Republican primary for this chosen candidate. And this is a bipartisan thing. It happened a few months ago in the House with Representative Chuy Garcia, Democrat from Illinois, who did the same thing, basically sewing up his seat for one of his staffers. To me, it seems not ideal from the standpoint of like giving candidates the opportunity to file and throw their hat in the ring, but also for voters to be able to weigh in on a full slate of candidates, especially in states and districts like these that are, one party or close to one party districts and states where, like, Montana, it's elected Democrats in the past, but like probably this is going to stay a Republican seat. And so the primary is the competition point that really matters. And this is basically taking it away. So that's what I'm fired up about this week.
It's like it's a pet peeve for sure. My other pet peeve is when people quit halfway through their term. I mean, I guess when you look at Texas and like the primary fight that's going on there, you can see like why Daines did this. I'm going to like save my party a bunch of heartache. But yeah, it's totally like removing the choice from voters to get to choose who they want. Let's say if you're an anti-establishment kind of person, I wouldn't be very happy by this, right? So lame.
Lame.
And surprising, which is another completely different topic we don't have to get into, but it is surprising. And I'm sure we'll talk about just how many Republican retirements there are this coming year. Super interesting. Okay, my topic is a little more positive. It's about Congress's oversight ability and them engaging in oversight. And it's been a while since I've talked about the Epstein files, so it's about that, right? The House Oversight Committee has voted to subpoena Pam Bondi, right? So the last big testimony they heard was from the Clintons, right? You can, as we talked about, there's clearly some like partisan angle there. So how this works, how a subpoena works, is it compels compliance for a person to come before Congress. So it forces them before come before Congress or provide documents, whatever it is being subpoenaed. And if you don't show up, Congress can hold you in contempt of Congress. So in theory and by legally, you can be arrested. Congress doesn't really arrest people. At least it hasn't since the 30s. But the threat of arrest is usually good enough to actually get people to comply with these subpoenas. So problematic Queen Nancy Mace, Republican from South Carolina, called for the vote in the House Oversight Committee, and 5 Republicans joined all the Democrats to bring Bondi before the Oversight Committee to testify on the Epstein files. So that is good oversight from just the more we hear from, the better, in my opinion. And it's an interesting a turn towards Republican lawmakers, I think.
Well, and Pam Bondi's last appearance before Congress was certainly fun to
It went
watch.
so well.
It went so well. It did have me wanting a sequel.
The ratings were good, I guess. That might be part of it, too.
I know, that always helps you get renewed for a second season. Good stuff. Yes, yay Congress, and yay Article
Yay
1
oversight.
oversight.
And yay
We are united
casework.
in that. Yes, and yay casework, and yay Anne.
yay
Thank
casework.
you,
Yes, thank
Anne
you,
Meeker. Thanks
Anne.
so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for letting me just get on my casework constituent oversight soapbox. This is clearly my favorite thing to talk about, and one that, like, I hope more people know that it's an option.
Yes, us too. And you're in good company. I learned so much. So thank you so much.
And thank you all for listening. We will catch you all next time. See ya.
Bye.